lacking the requisite psychological stability. Those were the 5 words my own brother chose to execute me with. My name is Vonda Heath, and this was not a courtroom. It was the first-class cabin of Flight 1128. Kaylin's manicured finger rested on the highlighted phrase in the legal document between us. The official verdict that my entire life's work, my service as a military pilot, had been nothing more than a symptom of a flawed character. He didn't just want to disinherit me, he wanted to annihilate my legacy. But he mistook my stillness for surrender. If you have ever felt that sting of being utterly devalued by someone who should have been in your corner, I need you to do 2 simple things for me right now. First, press the like button so I know you understand this feeling. Second, go to the comments and type one single word. Warrior. Just that one word. Type warrior. If you believe that this was not the end of my story, but the beginning of my fight. And to understand that war, you need to know it began in the immediate aftermath of another, the funeral of our father. The recycled air in the first-class cabin was a sterile blanket, doing nothing to smother the toxic tension radiating from the seat beside me. Outside my window, the jagged snow-covered peaks of the Cascade Range were a majestic, silent rebuke to the pettiness unfolding within this aluminum tube. I focused on their sharp edges, trying to borrow some of their strength. Kaylin, in his Brioni suit, adjusted the knot of his silk tie, a small gesture of a man completely at ease with his own cruelty. He signaled the flight attendant, ordering a single malt scotch with a flick of his wrist. He was performing, and I was his captive audience. "Father would be so disappointed to see you like this, Vonda," he began, his voice a low, polished weapon. He swirled the amber liquid, the ice cubes clinking like coins. "Wasting your youth on a meaningless soldier game, only to end up flying commercial like a commoner." He took a delicate sip, a perfect smirk playing on his lips. "But then you're used to not being welcomed, aren't you? Even at your own father's funeral." The familiar acid of controlled fury burned in my throat. I didn't turn from the window. I didn't give him the satisfaction. He called it a game. I called it a life of purpose. But in his world of leveraged buyouts and hostile takeovers, purpose was only measured in dollar signs. In his eyes, I had simply wasted my time. He let out a condescending sigh. "I suppose you're accustomed to being on the outside looking in." He then produced his primary weapon. Not a gun, but something far more damaging in his world. Paper. The leather-bound portfolio was already open, waiting. His finger, bearing our father's signet ring, a ring he'd claimed before the body was even cold, tapped the line of text, highlighted in a sickly yellow. "Here," he said, leaning in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was somehow more insulting than a shout. "It's from the final memorandum for the trust, lacking the requisite psychological stability to manage complex assets. Dad's entire legal team signed off on it." There it was, the kill shot. Not an emotional outburst, but a cold, legal execution. My entire life, my career, the very core of who I was, a pilot whose mind was her most valuable asset, had been rebranded. I wasn't competent, I wasn't disciplined, I was unstable. The word was designed to invalidate everything I had ever achieved, turning my strength into a disqualifying weakness. The air in my lungs turned to lead. This wasn't just about money, this was about erasure. Every instinct honed by years of training screamed at me to retaliate. But the pilot in me, the woman who knew that the most critical moments require absolute calm, took over. Without a word, I reached into my satchel and pulled out my logbook. It was a simple, black, hardcover notebook, a habit from my time as a test pilot. I opened it to a new page, uncapped my fountain pen, and with a hand that did not tremble, I recorded the details. Date: Flight 1128, CDCA. Then I wrote down his words exactly as he'd said them, enclosing them in quotation marks, lacking the requisite psychological stability. My own personal black box recorder. Kaylin watched, a slow, derisive smile spreading across his face. He saw this not as an act of defiance, but as a pathetic, impotent gesture. "Still that useless note-taking?" he scoffed, shaking his head as if pitying a delusional child. Do you think those scribbles can stand against a platoon of DC lawyers? Wake up, Vonda. This war was over before it even began. He leaned back, triumphant, taking a long, slow swallow of his scotch. The condescension in his eyes was absolute. He thought this was a game of lawyers and contracts. He didn't understand. This pen in my hand, this was my weapon. This book was my proving ground. This wasn't about feelings. It was about evidence. It was about facts. And facts, I knew, had a power all their own. It was in that precise moment of his supreme confidence that the world fractured. A deafening bang, a raw, explosive sound of metal failing catastrophically, erupted from the right wing. It was a sound I knew intimately from simulations, but hearing it in reality was a wholly different terror. The entire airframe was seized by a violent, bone-jarring shudder. A second impact, a sickening grind of shearing metal, followed immediately. The plane snapped into a terrifying, gut-wrenching bank to the right. Kalen's glass shot from his hand and shattered against the cabin wall. From behind the curtain, a wave of screams, pure and animalistic, washed over us. The oxygen masks deployed, dropping from the ceiling in a chaotic, swaying dance. The cabin lights flickered, died, and then came back on in a dim, emergency glow. I watched the transformation on my brother's face. The smugness, the arrogance, the polished cruelty, all of it was sandblasted away in a nanosecond, replaced by the stark, white, primal fear of a man who had just been reminded that all his money and all his lawyers could not negotiate with the laws of gravity. He whipped his head toward me, his eyes wide and pleading. The carefully constructed mask of the powerful Kalen Heath was gone. In its place was just a terrified man, trapped in a falling box. For the first time since we were children, he looked at me not with contempt, but with a desperate, silent question. And the pilot in me answered it. The game was far from over. It had just begun. The yellow oxygen mask dangled before my face, a pendulum marking the seconds in our descent into chaos. My training screamed at me to put it on, to secure my own survival before assisting others. But I didn't. For a frozen moment, the sight of it triggered a different kind of memory, a different kind of suffocation. It pulled me back through time to a crisp autumn evening in Georgetown, back to the first time I truly couldn't breathe in my own home. I was 17, and the acceptance letter from the United States Air Force Academy felt like a ticket to the sky, a validation of a dream I'd harbored in secret. My heart hammered against my ribs with pure joy as I burst into the formal living room, where my father, a powerful senator, and my brother Kalen were discussing political strategy. The air was thick with the scent of old leather and ambition. "Dad, I got in," I announced, the letter trembling in my hand. My father didn't even look up from his copy of the Wall Street Journal. "Got in where?" he asked, his tone absent, distracted. "The Air Force Academy." A sharp, barking laugh cut through the room. It was Kalen. "Oh, Vonda, honestly," he sneered, looking me up and down as if I were something distasteful he'd found on his shoe. "What are you going to do, fly paper airplanes? This family builds legacies with intellect, not with muscle." My father sighed then, a sound of profound weariness, and finally folded his newspaper. He looked at me, his eyes devoid of the pride I so desperately craved. "Vonda, I'm proud of your determination. But Kalen has a point. This is not our way." His words, so calm and dismissive, stole the air from my lungs more effectively than any depressurized cabin ever could. This is not our way. In that moment, I understood I was a deviation, a flawed tangent from the grand Heath trajectory of law, politics, and power. My mind, a turbulent cascade of memory, jumped forward, landing on 2 graduations, staged in stark, brutal contrast. Kalen's from Georgetown Law was one of the premier social events of the DC season. My father delivered a soaring speech about the brilliant future of the Heath dynasty, his voice booming with pride. Kalen's graduation gift was a silver Porsche 911, gleaming under the afternoon sun. 2 years later, I stood on the parade grounds at the Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs, my blue service dress uniform crisp and heavy with the weight of my achievement. My father was the only one who came. He sat near the back, and I could see him taking calls for most of the ceremony. When I finally found him in the dispersing crowd, he gave my shoulder a brief, awkward pat. "Well done. Your mother would have been proud." He paused, his gaze already drifting toward the exit. "Now, when are you going to get a real job?" No party, no gift. Just a question that hollowed me out, that painted my 4 years of relentless effort and sacrifice as a temporary detour, a youthful folly. That was the day I stopped seeking his approval and started seeking my own horizon. But even in the storm of these painful memories, a single point of light appeared. My Uncle Robert, my mother's younger brother. He was a NASA engineer, a quiet, brilliant man with kind eyes who saw the fire in me when everyone else saw a problem. He was gone now, taken by cancer years ago, but his voice echoed in my mind with perfect clarity. He once took me to the National Air and Space Museum to stand before the Spirit of St. Louis, that fragile silver plane that had carried Charles Lindbergh across an ocean. "You see that, Vonda?" he'd said, his voice a warm counterpoint to the cavernous silence of the museum. To fly the Atlantic alone, a person doesn't just need an airplane. They need an unshakable belief that they are right, even when the whole world says they're wrong. He looked down at me. "Your family might not understand. They look at the ground. You look at the sky. But the sky gets it. The sky doesn't judge, Vonda. It only demands courage." Those words became my true north, the internal compass that guided me through every slight, every dismissal, every lonely victory. They were the reason I could sit here now, in a failing aircraft, and feel not panic, but a strange, focused calm. Then the final, most venomous memory flooded in, the one that explained the coldness in Kaylin's eyes just moments ago. It was from the pinnacle of my career. I'd been selected for the test pilot program for the next generation of fighter jets, the elite of the elite. But a routine psychological evaluation flagged me. The report used a vague, insidious phrase, "potential for instability under sustained, non-kinetic pressure." It was bureaucratic jargon, meaningless in practice but a death sentence on paper. It stalled my career, knocking me off the trajectory I'd worked my entire life to achieve. The disappointment was a physical weight, a shroud I carried for years. I never understood it. My performance reviews were flawless. My flight records were impeccable. It was a ghost in my file I could never fight. Until years later, a friend in cybersecurity, doing me a favor, unearthed the horrifying truth. That single damaging phrase hadn't been the primary finding of the psychologist. It had been a minor note, taken out of context, and it had been leaked. Somehow, Kaylin had obtained a copy of that evaluation and had funneled it to my father's legal partners. It was his insurance policy, a piece of evidence to be held in reserve, proving my instability and solidifying his position as the sole, sound-minded heir to the Heath fortune. He hadn't just watched me fall, he had engineered it. The words he'd spat at me just before the explosion, lacking the requisite psychological stability, weren't just an insult. They were the culmination of a betrayal that had been festering for years, a long, patient act of sabotage. That knowledge didn't just hurt me, it reforged me, burning away the last vestiges of hope for family reconciliation and leaving behind something harder, something colder, something ready for the fight to come. Amid the chaos of Flight 1128, as the plane bucked and groaned, my mind retreated to the only place it knew to find order in turmoil, the crucible that had forged me. The cacophony of panicked screams faded, replaced by the familiar, controlled roar of a jet engine in the high desert. Edwards Air Force Base, Mojave. This was my sanctuary, my forge. Here, there were no polished insults or passive-aggressive power plays. There was only the brutal, honest physics of flight. There was G-force that threatened to tear the consciousness from your skull and split-second decisions where the only currency was competence. I remembered the endless nights spent in the flight simulator, a claustrophobic box that smelled of ozone and stale coffee. Over and over, I ran failure scenarios, engine fires, hydraulic failures, catastrophic structural damage, until my hands and feet moved on pure instinct, a physical extension of the machine's dying will. While Kaylin was attending cocktail parties in D.C., trading pleasantries and collecting political capital, I was learning how to recover from a flat spin at 40,000 feet. While he was networking, I was building a fortress of discipline and knowledge within myself. My family called it a waste, a strange, unfeminine obsession. But I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that it was the only way for me to survive in their world. I had to become so good at mine that they could never dismiss me again. That path demanded sacrifices they would never comprehend. The currency of my career was time, and I spent it freely. I missed my cousin's wedding. I missed my mother's 60th birthday. I missed Christmases, Thanksgivings, and Easters. Each absence was a small cut, a reminder of the chasm widening between my life and theirs. Phone calls home were minefields of guilt. Inevitably, I would hear Kaylin's voice in the background, smooth and laced with poison. "Everyone's here, Vonda, again," he'd say, loud enough for me to hear clearly. "Hope you're having fun with your toys." They never saw the other side of that coin. They never saw me eating a solitary Thanksgiving dinner on a plastic tray in a cavernous, empty mess hall, the fluorescent lights humming overhead. They never saw the long, sleepless nights before a high-risk test flight, my stomach churning with a cold, professional dread. They only saw my absence, and they interpreted it through the only lens they had: selfishness, indifference. That profound, isolating loneliness was a heavier burden than any physical endurance test the Air Force could devise. In the quiet moments, I would sometimes pick up a copy of Endurance, Shackleton's story of his incredible voyage. I read about his absolute refusal to surrender to the Antarctic ice, his relentless drive to bring his men home against impossible odds. His story became a quiet companion, a testament to the fact that survival is often a lonely, unglamorous affair. The validation I craved never came from a Washington, D.C. zip code. It came from the cracked, sun-beaten tarmac of the flight line. I remembered my crew chief, Sarge Martinez, a man of few words and profound competence. His approval was the gold standard. After one particularly harrowing test flight, a landing gear malfunction that nearly had me scraping the runway on the jet's belly, I taxied back, drenched in a cold sweat, my adrenaline finally giving way to exhaustion. Sarge didn't say much. He just met me on the ladder, handed me a cold bottle of water, and gave a curt nod. "Nice landing, Phantom," he said, his voice gruff. "You kept us all employed for another day." Phantom, my call sign. In that one word, spoken with the earned respect of a man who trusted me with his team's lives, I found more validation than in a lifetime of my father's empty praise for Kaylin. It was recognition based on action, not bloodline. On a lonely Christmas Eve, stuck on duty at a remote base in Nevada, a package arrived for me at the command post. It wasn't from my family. It was from Sarge and the maintenance crew. Inside was a container of homemade cookies and a simple, handwritten card. To Phantom. Thanks for always bringing us home safe. That small act of kindness, of chosen family, meant more than any Porsche ever could. My black logbook wasn't born from a desire for revenge. It began as a survival mechanism. It started after the deepest betrayal, after Kaylin had weaponized my psych evaluation. I realized then that words could be twisted, memories could be gaslit, but the written record was immutable. The first systemic entry came after a phone call with my father. I was struggling financially, and he had promised, in a rare moment of seeming empathy, to look into releasing funds from a small trust my mother had left me. A week later, Kaylin called. His voice was cold, dismissive. "Father says you misunderstood the conversation. Don't bother him with these petty issues again." The lie was so blatant, so audacious, it left me breathless. I was being told that my own memory, my own hearing, was faulty. That night, sitting alone in my Spartan apartment, I opened the notebook. I wrote down the date and time of my call with my father. I wrote down his exact words. Then I recorded the details of Kaylin's call, his exact phrasing. The act of writing it down was an anchor. It was a silent declaration. I am not crazy. I am not misremembering. This happened. The logbook became the ultimate proof of my own sanity, a quiet testament against the gaslighting, a black box preserving the truth in a family determined to erase it. Through the cacophony of shrieking alarms and passenger screams, a different sound cut through the noise, a voice that was not part of the chaos but a direct challenge to it. It wasn't meant for the passengers. It was broadcast over the internal comms, crisp, urgent, and military in its precision. Get Phantom from row 9 up here. I repeat, get Phantom to the flight deck, now. I froze. Phantom. My call sign. A name that belonged to a ghost, a version of me I thought was long buried under years of my family's dismissiveness. Hearing it spoken as a command in this metal coffin wasn't just a shock. It was an awakening. A jolt of high-voltage electricity that silenced the noise in my own head and brought the world into sharp, sudden focus. Kalen, his face a ghastly, bloodless shade of white, grabbed my arm. His grip, usually so composed, was now a desperate, crushing vice. "Sit down, Vonda. Don't you dare move," he hissed, his voice cracking with a terror he couldn't conceal. "You'll only make things worse. You don't fly these things." For the first time all day, I turned and met his terrified gaze. The years of practiced silence, of enduring his condescension as a survival tactic, fell away like a discarded cloak. I deliberately, methodically, peeled his trembling fingers off my arm. My voice, when I spoke, was as calm and steady as the horizon on a clear day, a stark contrast to his unraveling panic. "Not today, Kalen." With a decisive click that seemed to echo like a gunshot in the tense cabin, I unbuckled my seatbelt. It was so much more than just the act of standing up. It was the act of rising up from 2 decades of being pushed down, devalued, and systematically dismissed. It was a resurrection. The aisle pitched violently as the plane shuddered again, but my feet found their purchase on the lurching floor. My center of gravity, a sense honed by years of managing unstable platforms at supersonic speeds, held me firm. The faces of the other passengers turned toward me, a sea of confusion, raw fear, and a dawning, desperate hope. Across the aisle, a young boy, no older than 10, watched me with wide, unblinking eyes. His mother pulled him close, her body a shield against the unfolding horror. As I took my first determined step forward, a lead flight attendant, her face pale but her expression composed, stepped into my path. Her arm extended, a textbook execution of emergency protocol. "Ma'am, I need you to please return to your seat immediately." I didn't argue. I didn't explain my qualifications. I simply held her gaze. In my eyes, she wasn't seeing a hysterical passenger. She was seeing what my father and brother had refused to acknowledge my entire life. She saw the quiet, unwavering authority. The absolute, ice-cold focus. The lifetime of training that had prepared me for this exact, catastrophic moment. Her professional training screamed at her to force me back to my seat. But her human instincts, the part of her that could recognize competence under pressure, saw a solution. After a heartbeat that stretched for an eternity, I saw the conflict in her eyes resolve. She gave a short, almost imperceptible nod of assent. She lowered her arm and stepped aside, clearing my path to the cockpit. As I passed the boy and his mother, I heard him whisper. His small voice filled not with fear, but with awe. "Mommy, she looks like Captain Marvel." That small, unexpected shard of light, of a child's pure, uncomplicated belief, fortified me more than he could ever know. The cockpit door, which for me had always represented a sacred threshold, a gateway to a world where I truly belonged, swung open. The scene inside was controlled pandemonium. Red and amber warning lights flashed across the console, a frantic, silent disco of impending doom. Alarms blared in a relentless, maddening chorus of overlapping tones. Stall warnings, altitude alerts, engine failure sirens. The acrid smell of burning plastic and ozone from shorting electrical components hung thick and suffocating in the air. The captain, a man in his 60s with graying hair slicked to his forehead with sweat, was wrestling with the yoke, his knuckles white as he used every ounce of his strength to keep the crippled aircraft from entering a death spiral. The first officer was slumped in his seat, unconscious or nearly so, his head lolling with the violent movements of the plane. a casualty of the initial explosion's force. The captain glanced up as I entered, his eyes widening for a split second with recognition, followed by a wave of palpable, profound relief. "You phantom," he grunted, his voice strained and hoarse from shouting over the alarms. "Vonda Heath," I replied, my voice clipping the words with military brevity. "Air Force, retired, test pilot, I'm here to help." There was no time for pleasantries, no room for doubt. He didn't ask for my credentials. He didn't question my presence. He saw my posture, heard the command in my voice, and understood. He jerked his head toward the empty co-pilot's seat. "Get in it, Colonel." Colonel. The rank I had earned. The title Kaylin had never once used. Hearing it spoken here, in this moment of ultimate crisis, by a fellow professional who needed my skill, not my name, was the most profound validation of my life. From his seat in the first-class cabin, Kaylin watched it all unfold. He saw the sister he had just verbally eviscerated, the commoner he had belittled, the woman he had legally declared unstable, stride down the aisle with unshakable purpose. He saw the flight crew part for her like she was royalty. He saw the cockpit door open and swallow her whole. And through the still-open comm channel, he heard the captain's final respectful command, "Get in it, Colonel." The word struck him with the force of a physical blow. Colonel. The truth, stark and undeniable, crashed into the carefully constructed edifice of his superiority. His entire worldview, built on the power of inherited wealth, legal jargon, and a lifetime of contempt for my chosen path, began to visibly fracture. The inconvenient sister, the family footnote, the psychologically unstable liability, was now the only thing standing between him and a terrifying final freefall. His life, and the lives of 200 other souls, was now in the hands of the woman he had spent his entire life trying to destroy. The moment I slid into the co-pilot's seat, the world outside the cockpit ceased to exist. The screams, the fear, the ghost of my brother's face, they all dissolved into the background noise. I wasn't just a pilot anymore. I was a systems specialist in a hostile environment, and this dying aircraft was my patient. My hands moved with a machine-like precision that was born from thousands of hours of training. My fingers danced across the control panel, a blur of motion. I silenced the non-critical alarms, killing the auditory chaos that bred panic. My eyes scanned the cascade of warnings, triaging the failures, isolating the corrupted systems from the ones that could still save us. "Status report," I said to the captain, my voice devoid of emotion, a pure conduit for information. "Engine 2 is gone," he grunted, fighting the yoke. "Complete, uncontained failure. We're bleeding hydraulic pressure." My eyes confirmed his assessment on the display. "Hydraulic pressure is down 30% and falling," I reported back, my tone clipped and analytical. "We're losing control authority. Fast." I wasn't just reading the numbers, I was translating the chaos into actionable data. The captain glanced at me, his expression a mixture of grim focus and growing respect. He was no longer just seeing a retired officer, he was witnessing a master at her craft. The civilian air traffic control channels would be a saturated mess, a frantic logjam of panicked pilots and overwhelmed controllers. Wasting time, there was a luxury we didn't have. My hand moved to a secondary panel, a piece of retrofitted military hardware most civilian pilots never touched. I keyed in a long string of alphanumeric code, a sequence I knew as well as my own name. The panel flickered to life, opening a secure, encrypted communications channel. It was a priority line straight into the heart of North America's defensive nervous system. "Mayday, mayday, mayday," I spoke into my headset mic, the words formal and chillingly calm. "This is American Flight 1128, call sign Phantom, declaring an in-flight emergency." The response was instantaneous, no panic, no confusion. Just the calm, professional voice of a NORAD controller from deep within the Cheyenne Mountain Complex. "Phantom, this is Cheyenne. We read you 5x5. We've been tracking your anomaly. Stand by for support." Immediately, my navigation display, which had been flickering erratically, stabilized. A clean, steady stream of data began flowing in. Real-time weather patterns, topographical maps highlighting safe corridors, a prioritized list of viable emergency airfields. In a single action, I had pulled us from our terrifying isolation and plugged us into the most robust safety net on the planet. For the first time since the explosion, a sliver of control felt possible. It was in that precise moment of returning confidence that the ghost appeared. My hand was resting on a throttle quadrant, a familiar, reassuring weight. And then a memory, sharp and unwelcome as a shard of glass, pierced through my concentration. I saw the psych evaluation from years ago, the one that had crippled my career. I saw the damning phrase in cold, bureaucratic type, potential for instability under sustained, non-kinetic pressure. And then worse, the memory of its discovery. The day I finally saw the proof of Kaylin's betrayal. An email forwarded to me by my cybersecurity contact. From Kaylin Heath. To Father's legal counsel. Subject: our weapon. The body of the email was brief. Gentlemen, I believe this will be more than sufficient to make our case regarding Vonda's temperament. He hadn't just used my moment of vulnerability against me. He had named it. He had celebrated it. Our weapon. The rocking cockpit seemed to fade. The blare of the alarms dimmed. All I could see was Kaylin's smug, triumphant face. His voice, a venomous whisper from the past, echoed in my mind. See? Father was right. You don't belong in this world. You can't handle the pressure. For one terrifying, infinitesimal fraction of a second, my hand froze over the controls. Doubt, the insidious demon I'd battled my entire life, rose from the abyss. The voice sounded so reasonable, so certain. Kaylin is right. What if I freeze? What if I make the wrong call? What if I fail? But then another voice rose to meet it. Deeper, stronger. It was the gravelly, no-nonsense voice of Colonel Viper Sullivan, the legendary female pilot who had washed out more cadets from the test pilot school at Edwards than any instructor in history. She was the one who taught me how to fly prototypes through the restricted airspace over Area 51, a woman who treated physics like a religion and fear like an irritating distraction. I was on the verge of failing a complex simulation, overwhelmed by emotion, and she had gotten on the comms, her voice cutting through my panic. The sky doesn't care about your feelings, Heath, she had barked. It doesn't care if you're scared or angry or if your brother is a son of a bitch. It only cares about your next action. Now, fly the plane. I took a sharp, steadying breath, the recycled air cool in my lungs. I banished the image of Kaylin, crushing it into a speck of dust in the vastness of my responsibility. This wasn't about him. This wasn't about proving him wrong or avenging the past. This was about the 200 souls behind me, their lives hanging on my every decision. This was about the calm, professional voice from NORAD waiting for my command. I gripped the yoke, my hand steady once more. The doubt was gone, replaced by the cold, clean fire of purpose. NORAD, this is Phantom, I said, my voice ringing with an authority that left no room for question. Report all viable landing options, immediately. Phantom, we have bad news. The voice from NORAD was unnervingly calm, a clinical detached tone that was somehow more terrifying than a panicked shout. Thermal analysis shows your number one engine is overheating catastrophically. Debris from the first explosion likely caused critical, cascading damage. We expect failure at any moment. The words hung in the cockpit, a death sentence delivered from the safety of a mountain bunker miles below. I looked at the captain. The last vestiges of color had drained from his face, leaving behind a gray, ashen mask of utter resignation. He didn't need to say anything. We both knew what this meant. There was no backup for the backup. There was nothing left. And then, it happened. It wasn't a bang this time, not a shudder. It was a dry, definitive snap, a sound like a massive tree branch breaking under an impossible weight. And then, silence. An absolute, profound, and utterly unnatural silence. The last engine had died. The steady, life-sustaining roar that had been the constant, reassuring backdrop to this entire ordeal was simply gone. In an instant, This massive 70-ton marvel of modern engineering was reduced to its most basic, brutal truth. It was a rock, a piece of metal, falling through the sky. The only sound was the high, thin shriek of the wind rushing past the fuselage, a hungry, predatory sound that seemed to be celebrating our newfound helplessness. Every system powered by the engines went dark in a domino effect of failure. The flight displays, our eyes into the storm, flickered and died, leaving us blind. The hydraulic pressure gauge flatlined to zero. We were now a glider, a very heavy, very unaerodynamic glider, with no power, no primary flight controls, and a rapidly diminishing supply of hope. We were falling. And that is when the demon that lived inside me, the one forged by my family, made its final vicious attack. For 4 seconds, my mind went completely white. It was a total system failure. Not just a hesitation, not a moment of fear. It was a void. A complete and utter emptiness where my training, my experience, my very identity used to be. And into that void rushed the voices, the ghosts I had carried with me my entire life. Kaylin's sneering laugh, my father's disappointed sigh, the cold, clinical text from the psych evaluation. They merged into a single, deafening roar inside my skull. A single word screamed from the abyss of my deepest, darkest fears. Unstable. Incompetent. Failure. I could see my hands resting on the yoke, but they felt like they were miles away. They were disconnected, useless appendages belonging to a stranger. I could hear the captain shouting my name. "Vonda! Vonda! Pull up!" But his voice was a distant, distorted echo coming from across an impossible gulf. 212 souls, their lives balanced on a razor's edge, and I was frozen. Completely and utterly paralyzed. Just like they always said I would be. The prophecy had come true. A wave of sickening, paralyzing shame washed over me, heavier than any G-force I had ever known. I was going to fail them all. They were right all along. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. My entire life had been leading to this moment, and I was nothing. And on the 4th second, in the deepest, blackest moment of that paralysis, something else ignited. It started as a tiny, defiant spark in the frozen darkness of my soul, and then it erupted into a pure, white-hot inferno. It was rage, a primal, cleansing, and utterly incandescent fury. No. The word was a silent detonation in my mind, a blast that shattered the chorus of ghosts. You bastards will not win. I wasn't screaming out loud, but the oath was the loudest thing I had ever heard. It was a declaration of war, forged in the heart of my own personal hell against the wardens of my own self-doubt. You will not define me. Not today, not ever. My father, Kaylin. The faceless bureaucrats who had stamped my file with a single, damning word. They had built a psychological cage around me my entire life, brick by brick, insult by insult. And in this moment, I saw it for the fragile, pathetic thing it was. And I refused to die in it. This is my cockpit. This is my sky. And you will not take it from me. The rage was a defibrillator to my soul. It shocked my system back to life, the pure, unadulterated anger burning through the fog of fear and shame like a plasma torch. The blood roared back into my head. My senses, which had been numb and distant, came back online, sharper and clearer than ever before. The voices were gone. I no longer heard Kaylin. I no longer heard my father. All I could hear was the wind, the creak of the straining airframe, and the powerful, steady drumbeat of my own heart, a war drum calling me to battle. I have control, I said. My voice was a raw, ragged thing, shredded by the internal scream, but it was lined with steel. Pure steel. The Vonda who had frozen 4 seconds ago was gone. She had died in that abyss, a final casualty of a long and bitter war. The person who took her place was someone new, someone who had stared into the void of her own self-doubt, seen the face of her demon, and had not blinked. I pulled back on the yoke, not with the delicate touch of a pilot, but with the raw, brute force of a survivor, using my entire body, every ounce of muscle and will, to fight the dead weight of the aircraft. Slowly, Groaning in protest like a dying beast, the nose of the massive plane began to respond. It began to lift. I was back, reborn in the fire of my own fury. I keyed the mic, my voice now clear and ringing with an authority that was absolute, an authority that came not from a rank, but from the simple, undeniable fact of survival. "NORAD, this is Phantom," I commanded. "Find me a flat piece of land, a highway, a field, anything. I'm putting this thing down." I was no longer the victim of my past. I was no longer the quiet, dutiful daughter trying to earn her place. I was the storm. With the ghosts of my past banished, the cockpit transformed. It was no longer a chamber of fear. It was my arena. This powerless falling aircraft was no longer a metal coffin. It was an unpowered glider, and I was its conductor. A symphony of survival was about to begin, and every action had to be precise. Every decision, perfect. "Captain, dump fuel." "Now," I commanded, my voice sharp, cutting through the whine of the wind. "We need to shed every ounce of excess weight." While he initiated the sequence, my mind was racing, calculating. "I need our optimal glide ratio. Every second we can stay in the air buys us another mile on the ground." We fell into a rhythm, a seamless partnership born of shared crisis. He, with his decades of commercial flight experience, and I, with my specialized knowledge of extreme flight dynamics. At first, he would fly, his hands wrestling with the dead controls, while I translated the complex data streams from NORAD into simple, actionable numbers: airspeed, descent rate, heading. Then, as the sheer physical and mental strain began to take its toll, he looked at me, his expression grim but clear. He was an excellent pilot, but gliding a 70-ton commercial jetliner was a scenario so far outside the realm of normal operations that it belonged to the world of test pilots and madmen. He nodded towards the yoke. "She's all yours, Colonel. My expertise ends here." It wasn't an admission of defeat. It was an act of ultimate professionalism and trust. He was handing over command to the person with the better skill set. "I have the aircraft," I replied, my voice a steady, formal acknowledgement. My hands closed around the controls, and for the first time since this ordeal began, I felt a sense of belonging. I wasn't flying by instruments alone anymore. I was flying by feel, by the thousands of hours of instinct etched into my very being. Sensing the subtle shifts in airflow over the wings, feeling the groans of the airframe as I coaxed it into a stable, controlled descent. "Phantom, we have a potential solution. It is a long shot." The voice from Cheyenne Mountain crackled in my ear, pulling me back to the strategic battle. "There's an emergency high-altitude airfield in Wyoming, codename High Mesa." It was a Cold War relic, a dispersed landing site for B-52 bombers decommissioned in the 80s. It's at the absolute edge of your glide envelope. A satellite image materialized on my auxiliary display, a ghost from another era. It was a single, stark strip of concrete, cracked and weathered, surrounded by miles of empty, unforgiving plateau. No control tower, no runway lights, no fire and rescue teams waiting for us. Nothing but a long, flat stretch of hope. It was beautiful. "Confirmed, Cheyenne," I said without hesitation. "Transmit precise runway elevation, heading, and surface wind data. Now!" Just as that fragile hope began to take root, a frantic call burst through from the cabin. "Cockpit, we have a passenger in cardiac arrest. We need a doctor." A fresh wave of panic could be heard rising in the background. The captain looked at me, his eyes wide with a new layer of worry. A medical emergency was a serious crisis on a normal flight. In our situation, it was a catastrophic distraction. Any loss of focus now could doom us all. But I refused to let chaos take root. I flipped the switch for the cabin PA system. My voice boomed through the aircraft, not loud but imbued with an unshakable calm that commanded attention. "Passengers, remain seated. Crew, if there is a doctor on board, please render assistance. If not, begin chest compressions immediately." I paused, letting the authority in my voice settle over the frightened cabin. "I give you my word. We will be on the ground before the clock runs out." It was a promise made on the edge of a knife. A declaration of intent against impossible odds. But I could feel its effect. The rising tide of panic in the cabin subsided, replaced by a tense, focused silence. A silence built on trust. The minutes stretched into an eternity as we glided through the sky, a silent metal bird on a final, desperate approach. High Mesa grew from a line on a screen to a faint smudge on the horizon, then finally resolved into a pale, lonely ribbon of concrete. Time was up. I began the final approach checklist, my voice a steady monotone. Flaps, no hydraulics. Slats, no hydraulics. I looked at the captain. The landing gear may not lock, I stated, the grim reality hanging between us. Pressure is too low. We have to prepare for a belly landing. Skidding to a stop on the fuselage would be a violent, unpredictable end, with a high chance of the aircraft breaking apart. But then, as the runway rushed up to meet us, an idea sparked in my mind. A dangerous, unorthodox maneuver I had only ever practiced in simulations. A last-ditch, high-risk gamble. No, I said, a new plan forming instantly. We're not doing a belly landing. The captain looked at me as if I'd gone insane. I'm going to bring the nose down just before touchdown, I explained, my eyes never leaving the view ahead. Use the forward momentum to force the main gear down and into the locked position upon impact. His face paled. It was an incredibly risky move. A pilot's instinct is to flare, to lift the nose to soften the landing. Deliberately driving the nose gear into the ground first could cause the entire strut to collapse, sending the plane cartwheeling down the runway in a ball of flame. But then he looked at my eyes. He didn't see a gambler. He saw a test pilot. He saw absolute, unwavering focus. He saw a calculation that had already been made. He took a deep breath. Understood, he said, his voice firm, his trust absolute. Godspeed, Phantom. There was no more time for calculation, no more space for doubt. The cracked, gray ribbon of High Mesa's runway rushed up to meet us with a dizzying, terrifying speed. The wind didn't just howl past the cockpit, it shrieked, a final deafening protest against our attempt to defy gravity. My world, once vast and open, had narrowed to this single stretch of concrete and the heavy, unresponsive controls clutched in my hands. The fate of everyone on board rested on a single, desperate gamble. Brace! I yelled into the PA system, the single word a gunshot cutting through the cabin's tense, prayer-filled silence. Brace for impact! My hands moved with a will of their own, a lifetime of training, discipline, and instinct converging into this one, singular moment. I eased the yoke forward, a gentle but deliberate pressure that felt like heresy, tilting the nose of the massive aircraft down. It was a move that defied every instinct of a pilot, a direct and intentional violation of the sacred rule to flare before landing, to soften the blow. I was doing the opposite. I was inviting the violence. The nose gear hit the crumbling, weed-strewn concrete first. A violent, bone-jarring shriek of tortured rubber erupted as the tire made contact, instantly disintegrating under the immense, focused force. The entire airframe convulsed. A shockwave of energy so powerful it felt like the plane had been struck by lightning, ripping through the cabin from front to back. From my seat in first class, Kalen squeezed his eyes shut, his teeth clenched, a low groan escaping his lips as he braced for the inevitable, fiery end. He was certain this was the moment of my ultimate failure, the final, fatal proof of my instability, a mistake that would kill them all. But he didn't understand. I wasn't just flying. I was waging war on physics, and I had wagered everything on a single, brutal equation of force and motion. The initial focused impact of the nose gear sent a massive, rearward jolt of kinetic energy through the fuselage, a shockwave designed for one purpose. And just as I had calculated in that split-second decision in the sky, that force was just enough. It slammed the two main landing gear assemblies down and back from their bays. A loud, resonant clang echoed through the airframe, a sound I felt through the floor, through the seat, and deep into my very soul. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. On the dark console, against all odds, the two landing gear indicator lights flickered from red to green. Locked. They were locked. The nanosecond the lights turned green, I yanked back on the yoke with every ounce of strength I possessed. The nose lifted off the tarmac, and the full weight of the 70-ton Boeing 737 slammed down onto the main gear. The sound was apocalyptic. A deafening, grinding roar of metal screaming in protest against concrete as the wheels, now locked, bore the impossible load. A brilliant shower of orange sparks, a firework display of improbable survival, erupted from beneath the wings, lighting up the desolate landscape. The acrid, suffocating stench of burning rubber and superheated metal flooded the cockpit. The plane was on the ground, but we were far from safe. We were a runaway train, a metallic beast on a leash of fractured concrete, skidding down the abandoned runway with no effective way to stop, careening directly towards the sheer, 1,000-foot drop of a deep canyon at the far end. "Brakes!" I roared, jamming the emergency brake lever with all my might, the plastic groaning under my grip. The captain, snapping back to action, stomped on the rudder pedals with all his strength, trying to steer the fishtailing monster. The aircraft slewed sideways, a horrifying, uncontrolled metal-on-concrete skid that threatened to rip the wings clean off the fuselage. Through the side window of the cockpit, I could see the edge of the canyon getting closer, closer, the empty blue sky beyond it an invitation to oblivion. 200 feet. 150. "More!" I bellowed, pulling harder on the brake, my muscles screaming in protest. We were fighting a war against momentum, inch by bloody inch. The plane shuddered, bounced, and with a final violent lurch that threw us forward against our harnesses, it slid to a halt. The nose of the aircraft hung over the abyss, so close I could see the rocks on the canyon floor thousands of feet below. And then, the silence. A profound, ringing silence, broken only by the sound of my own ragged, desperate breathing and the frantic, glorious beating of my own heart. For a single, suspended moment, the entire universe held its breath. Then, from the cabin behind me, it began. A single, tentative clap, then another. And then the entire airplane erupted. A tidal wave of raw, human sound washed over me. Cheers, sobs, hysterical laughter, a raw, explosive, beautiful chorus of life. They were alive. We were alive. But I sat motionless, my hands still fused to the controls, unable to let go. My body was trembling, the adrenaline beginning its slow, painful retreat. I reached for my black logbook, my hand shaking so hard I could barely uncap the pen. I found a clean page and wrote, 4 seconds. Next time, 0. It was a private acknowledgement of my failure, and a solemn vow for my future. The captain slumped back in his seat, turning to look at me. The expression in his eyes was something beyond respect, beyond gratitude. It was pure, unadulterated awe. He simply shook his head, unable to find the words. In the now open aisle of the first-class cabin, Kalen stood frozen, his hand gripping the back of a seat for support. He stared toward the cockpit, at the open door, at the silhouette of his sister against the bright, indifferent Wyoming sky. He saw the woman he had tried to erase, the sibling he had branded a failure. And for the first time in his entire life, my brother had absolutely nothing to say. I sat there for a long time, just listening to the sounds of survival. That moment of silence from my brother was a victory louder than any explosion. If you've ever had a moment where your actions finally silenced the critics, where the truth of who you are was proven beyond all doubt, hit the like button for me. And in the comments, I just want to see one word that I know you understand. Type Vindication. Let me know you were here for this. The silence in the aftermath of the landing was fleeting. In the hours that followed, as emergency crews swarmed the forgotten runway at High Mesa, a new kind of storm began to gather. The story of Phantom Pilot Saves Flight 1128 became a national sensation, a feel-good headline in a weary news cycle. I was hailed as a hero. But while I was giving calm, factual statements to the exhausted but grateful investigators from the NTSB and FAA, my brother was already waging a different war. His brief, stunned silence had evaporated the moment his feet were safely on solid ground. I saw him in the makeshift command tent, pacing back and forth, his phone pressed to his ear. He wasn't calling family to tell them he was safe. He was calling his PR team in D.C. He was launching a preemptive strike. By evening, The first shots were fired. A different narrative began to surface on several influential political blogs, whispered into the echo chamber of the internet. My old psychological evaluation, the weapon he had held in reserve for years, was leaked. The story was expertly spun. My heroic act was reframed as the reckless gamble of an unstable individual with a history of impulsive behavior. They twisted my triumph into a character flaw. I was no longer a savior. I was a liability who just happened to get lucky. I read the articles on a borrowed tablet, the words blurring in the harsh fluorescent light of the temporary barracks. The familiar, sickening ache of betrayal returned, sharper and more painful than the memory of the 4-second freeze. He had watched me save his life, and his first instinct was to try and destroy my reputation. The official NTSB hearing took place a week later in Denver. The room was cold, formal, and utterly devoid of the raw emotion of the event itself. Kalen was there, flanked by a team of stone-faced lawyers, not as a witness, but as an interested party representing the Heath family trust. His presence was a declaration of war. Their questions, posed by an attorney working in concert with Kalen's team, were insidious, dripping with polite venom. They weren't focused on the engine failure, they were focused on me. "Colonel Heath," the lawyer began, his voice smooth and condescending, "is it true that an official Air Force evaluation once flagged you as having a potential for instability?" The room fell silent. This was the ambush. This was Kalen's kill shot, delivered in a sterile, professional setting. But I had been preparing for this battle my entire life. I looked at the panel of investigators, my expression calm. That phrasing is a partial quote taken out of context from a preliminary report issued over a decade ago. I stated, my voice even. A report which, I might add, was classified and improperly leaked. I let that hang in the air for a moment. But since you've raised the question of my state of mind, I have brought my own records. I placed my black logbook on the table. It wasn't a diary filled with feelings. It was a flight log of my life. My actions on board Flight 1128 were not impulsive, I continued, turning the pages. At 1432 Zulu, I established a secure link with NORAD. At 1435, I ordered a fuel dump to reduce weight, increasing our glide ratio by an estimated 8%. My decision to attempt a high-risk forward gear landing was based on specific test flight simulations I personally conducted for landing gear failure scenarios in unpowered aircraft. I didn't use emotion, I used data, I used the cold, hard language of my profession, building an unassailable fortress of facts. But the final, irrefutable truth came from the cockpit voice recorder, the plane's own black box. They played the audio for the entire room. We all listened to the explosion, the blare of the alarms, the captain's strained voice, and then we heard it. The captain's desperate, urgent command, spoken before I'd even left my seat. "Requesting Phantom's assistance, get Phantom, up here, now." That one word, Phantom, spoken by the captain in a moment of crisis, obliterated Kalen's entire narrative. It proved I hadn't seized control. I hadn't acted impulsively. I had been requested, summoned as a recognized expert. The game was over. The truth, recorded on a loop of magnetic tape, had won. As the hearing concluded, the lead investigator announced that their preliminary findings indicated my actions were not just heroic, but had likely been the only course of action that could have resulted in a successful outcome. I walked out of that room and past Kalen. He was standing motionless, his lawyers whispering furiously to him. He looked diminished. A man who had built his entire world on the power of his words, now rendered speechless by a truth he couldn't spin. That night, he came to my hotel room. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a desperate, hollowed-out look. "Vonda, we're family," he began, the words sounding weak, pathetic. I cut him off, my voice as cold and hard as the Wyoming plateau. "No." He flinched. "What?" "You and I share DNA," I said, looking him straight in the eye. "That is a biological fact. Family is a choice. It is built on trust, on respect, on loyalty. You destroyed all of that piece by piece every time you chose to undermine me. You completed the demolition when you took my deepest wound and tried to use it as your weapon. He started to stammer an apology, a string of empty, meaningless words. I held up my hand, a simple gesture that silenced him instantly. I don't need your apology, Kaylin. Apologies are for people who intend to change. What I need is for you to be gone from my life. I took a step forward, and for the first time, he took a step back. The boundary is drawn. The war is over. From this day forward, I am not your sister. I let the words land, letting him feel their full, devastating weight. I am Colonel Vonda Heath, and you were just a passenger on a flight I saved. In the quiet weeks that followed the hearing, the world tried to define me. The media called me a hero. The Air Force saw an asset to be reclaimed. A few weeks after my name was officially cleared by the NTSB, Colonel Elias Vance, a man I deeply respected, came to see me in Denver. He laid out the offer I would have once considered the culmination of my life's ambition: full reinstatement, a command position in the new hypersonic test flight program, and a clear path to general. It was everything I had ever fought for, and I heard myself say, no. Thank you, Colonel, I said, the words feeling strange and new and powerful on my tongue. But I've flown enough for one lifetime. I've fought gravity, I've fought failing metal, and I've fought my own demons. I'm ready for a different kind of mission now. A new idea, one that had been quietly forming in the silence since the landing, came into focus. Instead of accepting his offer, I made a counter-proposal. I wanted a new role. A civilian instructor position at the Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs, developing and teaching a new curriculum on crisis psychology and decision-making under extreme pressure. I want to teach them about the 4 seconds, I explained to a surprised Colonel Vance. I want to teach them how to secure the sky inside their own heads before they ever try to secure the sky outside. I became something of a legend at the academy. My classroom was unlike any other. I didn't just teach aerodynamics or systems management. I taught fear. I taught self-doubt. I taught the ugly, inconvenient, and powerful truths of human fallibility. My most famous lecture, the one cadets would talk about for years, was titled, Welcome to Your 4 Seconds. I stood before them, young men and women with brilliant, hungry eyes, and I told them the unvarnished truth of my own failure. There will come a moment in your career and in your life, I would say, my voice quiet but carrying to the back of the auditorium, when you will freeze. When the training will vanish, the noise will be deafening, and you will feel utterly and completely lost. In that moment, do not fight it. Do not shame yourself for it. Acknowledge it, take a breath, and then remember why you fly. I would often quote the researcher Brené Brown, whose work had helped me understand my own journey. Vulnerability is not weakness. It is our most accurate measure of courage. Your 4 seconds of terror do not define you. What you do in the 5th second, that defines everything. My new legacy wasn't forged in the sky, but on the ground, in the lives I could now touch. The most tangible evidence of this was Ronan, the boy from the flight who had called me Captain Marvel. Now a teenager, he found me. He had read about my new position, and his family had moved to Colorado Springs so he could take flying lessons from me. Under my guidance, he didn't just learn how to handle a Cessna. He absorbed the philosophy of resilience, of facing fear head-on. He was becoming the kind of pilot and the kind of man I knew the world needed. Around that time, a thick envelope arrived from Kaylin's attorneys. It was not a lawsuit. It was not a threat. It was the charter for a new foundation, the Heath Aviation Scholarship. Kaylin, in what seemed to be the first truly selfless act of his life, had used a significant portion of his inheritance to endow it in perpetuity. It was meant to fund the education of aspiring pilots from underprivileged backgrounds. The sole condition was that I, Colonel Vonda Heath, would serve as the sole administrator and chairman of the board. I sat with the documents for a long time. This wasn't forgiveness, not in the simple, easy way people imagine. It was something more complex. It was a recognition. It was, in his own transactional way, an act of atonement. I accepted, not for him, and not even for me. I accepted it for the future phantoms who were out there, dreaming of a sky they didn't think they could reach. It was my way of taking the toxic legacy of my family's name and forging it into something new, something that belonged to the heavens. The story ends a year later. I am standing on the deck of my small house in Colorado Springs, watching the sun rise over the magnificent jagged peaks of the Rocky Mountains. The air is crisp and clean. I'm drinking my morning coffee, not from a military issue mug, but from a simple, handmade ceramic cup, a gift from Ronan. On the side, it says, "The sky is not the limit." I open a new black logbook. The pages are pristine, empty, a landscape of possibility. On the very first page, I don't record an insult or a failure. I write 4 short lines, a new flight plan for a new life. Second 1, breathe in. Second 2, breathe out. Second 3, forgive. Second 4, fly. I did not return to the sky in the way the Air Force had wanted. I'd found a new one, a bigger one, a quieter one. I'd found my own. Finding my own sky wasn't about that one landing. It was about the small daily choices to heal, to draw boundaries, and to define my own worth. My story is now told, but I know it's not the only one. If this journey has resonated with you, if you believe in the power of rewriting your own narrative, then I personally invite you to subscribe to the Chosen Revenge Library. My story is just one of many here that serve as a testament to the strength it takes to find your own dawn. Subscribe and become part of this community of warriors.